The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? lit. Real, live, lit. Right? The revolution is lit.
Uhuru comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Taught Me Sunday study, live with the leader of the African nation, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. This week, we take a pause from the History of Anti-Colonial Revolution series to watch a presentation newly released from the party's archives, themed The African Nation Speaks for Itself, Then and Now. It is the keynote address given by Chairman Omali Yeshitela at the Congresso Internacional in Huelva, Spain in 2007. What this presentation further reveals is the lifelong work of Chairman Omali Yeshitela to develop revolutionary theory that informs the practice of the African People's Socialist Party and the overall African liberation movement. It is evidence of the chairman's decades-long struggle to extend the struggle for African independence and socialism to every corner of this earth. It also reveals the agency, aspirations, and interests of African people, as Chairman Omali represented African people as the leader of the African nation. Further, what we'll witness is the consistency of both the theory of African internationalism, developed by Chairman Omali Yeshitela, which has gone to explain the colonial mode of production as one global process, creating misery and exploitation for Africans and colonized people for the benefit of the colonizer, as well as the consistency of U.S. imperialism, which at this time was initiating war against Iraq and Afghanistan. We will watch this hour-long presentation, take a short break for announcements, then hear from Chairman Omali Yeshitela as we discuss the ideas and significance of this video. Before we start, make sure to share this study far and wide. Take a moment right now to like this video, tag your friends, and subscribe to our YouTube and Chairman Omali's Twitch channel. This government wants to silence our community, our leadership, and ideas, but you can push back by sharing this study right now. Let's watch the chairman's keynote address from Huelva, Spain in 2007.
Mr. Yeshitela, I told you that the concept of the times in the South is different than in another parts of the world. Chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, founder of the Barn and Spear newspaper, which have published continuously since the 16th. Author of the powerful new book, One Africa, One Nation, 40 years of bold leadership and unwavering commitment to the struggle for the self-determination of the African community. Formerly known as Joseph Waller, the very young leader of the junta of militant organizations in the 1960s, Omali Yeshitela is today a veteran in the struggle for African freedom, giving continuity and experience. Chairman Omali Yeshitela has built the African People's Socialist Parties, founded in 1972, to complete the Black Revolution. Since that time, the African People's Socialist Party has established Uhuru House, Black community organizing centers around the country, founded the National People's Democratic Uhuru Movement to defend the democratic rights of the African community, and built economic institutions controlled by and benefiting the African working class, such as Uhuru Black Gym of our own in St. Petersburg, Florida, the African People's Socialist Party's national headquarters. Today, he is in Huelva with us. He has told me that this is their first visit in Spain, not only in Huelva, only in Spain, for contributing to our scientific works, but mainly for collaborating to our better understanding on Africa. Whenever you heard the word, thank you very much for coming.
I would like to thank you very much for the introduction, and also to offer my profound thanks and appreciation to the organizers of this Congress. I would also like to express my appreciation to the other presenters for this Congress, and to all of you for coming out to share your time with us during this very significant event for the next few days. First of all, I would like to say that coming from the United States, I feel that it is absolutely necessary that I express my absolute condemnation of the U.S. aggression, occupation, new colonization of Iraq and Afghanistan. I do not think it would be appropriate for me, leaving the United States, to come and speak to such an august body without publicly expressing the fact that there are a number of us who live in the United States who are opposed to colonialism, however it looks, in whatever period of time it exists. So I want to say that first of all. Secondly, I would like to say that my esteemed comrade here, when we first met, asked me the question of whether I am aware of the roots of my family in Africa. My answer is no. And beyond that, I told him that I am not curious as to where my family comes from in Africa. And the reason I am not curious of where my family comes from in Africa is because Africa today, trapped in artificial borders created by imperialism in 1884 and 85, is too involved now with ethnic politics and politics based on some assumption to a relationship to an artificial nation which in most instances did not exist before the Berlin Conference of 1884 and 85. I am an African. That is good enough for me. I am one who understands that although I live in the United States of America, that it would be impossible for an African to get on a ship in Africa as an African to arrive in America and become something else. If I was an African when I got on the ship in Africa, I had to be an African when I got off the ship in America. So we were Africans then, we're Africans now. And that is the perspective that I come from. And I want to also say to you that my perspective is informed by philosophy, by an ideology. I do not pretend to speak to you as though we do not live in a very real world, and where the conditions that we are talking about in Africa are not conditions that simply occurred, but they are conditions which have been imposed on Africa. And so I hope that those of you who have come out to this Congress are able to really think of Africa in new ways. I'm hoping that people who have come here did not come with the anticipation of being able to express more pity for Africa. It is my hope that you will become outraged, if you are not already outraged, by the relationship that Africa has to Europe, North America. I am politically influenced by philosophies of people like Marcus Garvey, Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Robert Mangalisisa Sobukwe, and Malcolm X. These are some of my ideological parents. I am someone who speaks to you as a social worker. I am a revolutionary. I am convinced that Europe, North America, do not have the ability to do right by Africa, but it is the responsibility of Africans, ourselves, to organize, to overturn the relationship that we have with Europe and with North America. Unfortunately, the last 500 years of history has been a history of imperialism. We wake up today in the 21st century and look out upon a world which gives the impression of having always been like this. But it has not always been like this. The fact of the matter is that Africa is the richest continent on earth in terms of natural resources. 12 million square miles. When you count the islands of natural resources, of tremendous wealth, a place where billions of dollars every year are taken from Sierra Leone as an example, in the form of diamonds on the one hand. But on the other hand, where the African workers who bring those diamonds to the surface, for Europe, for North America especially, are expected to live off 30 cents a day, and if they're lucky, a cup of rice. Africa is not poor. Africa is being looted. We talk about an Africa where each of us who has a cell phone, or I think they're referred to as mobiles here in Europe, has an instrument that requires for its workings a strategic mineral known as coltan. 87% of the world's coltan is located in what is now referred to as Democratic Republic of Congo. Since 1998, from 5 to 7 million African people have died in Congo as a consequence of proxy wars, being fought, among other things, for those resources. Africa is not poor. Africa is being looted. Not only looted of natural resources, but human resources as well. And this is something that has been going on for a very long time. So I'm hoping that this Congress will be able to look at the question of Africa, its relationship to the North, if you will, not through pitying eyes, but through eyes of outrage. I'm hoping that this Congress, at minimum, will bring people to a different consciousness about the relationship that Africa has to the world, and perhaps allow us to come to some different conclusions about what it is that we can do to change this relationship. I come from the United States, where oftentimes this country is referred to as a nation of immigrants. Perhaps you have heard of the United States being referred to as a nation of immigrants. It is a concept that we disagree with. We don't see the United States as being a nation of immigrants. Rather, we see it as a prison of nations, an entity that was founded as a consequence of an aggression that was made against the indigenous population there, who are called Indians now. The majority of the survivors are currently living in concentration camps that are known as reservations, where they have a lifespan in the 40s. They talk about the United States being a nation of immigrants, but I would tell you that African people who are in the United States did not come as immigrants. We came as captives. And our conditions of existence in the United States are conditions which stem from the relationship that the United States and Europe have with Africa. When we look at the conditions, when we look at Katrina, and I think many of you are familiar with the Hurricane Katrina and the consequences, the United States response that sent military troops in to cordon off the African people after having allowed Africans to die unnecessarily in that. When we look at the Katrina, it's like looking at any other situation on the continent of Africa itself. Because the conditions of Africans in the United States is an extension of the conditions of Africa itself. That our relationship to imperialism is the same in the United States as it is in Africa. I should have said to you that it is impossible for an African in the United States to be an African American, as we are sometimes called. To be an African American is an African American, we believe, is the same as saying that someone is a slave and a slave master at the same time. It is impossible to be both a slave and a slave master. America built itself at the expense of Africa. And so we say that we are not African Americans, we are Africans. And we are Africans regardless of whether or not many of our people understand our historical relationship with Africa, because the reality is that most of us have got our education in the United States, in Africa itself, from the colonizer who is responsible for our conditions. So we got the same education as you got. And when we were taught in schools, we were taught that slavery was something wonderful. In fact, even now, the president of France talks about how Africa has never brought any contribution to the world, that it is quite uncivilized. And the British and the French talk now about having to introduce into schools the benefits of colonialism, the goodness, the good things that colonialism did. My friends, the reality is this, that when Africans met Europe, it was not Africa who was poor, it was Europe that was poor. When Africans met Europe, it was not Africans who were unhealthy, it was Europe that was unhealthy. The reality is that when we met Europe, Europe lived during an era of feudalism. There was no freedom for Europeans. this concept of Europe visiting the rest of the world to bring us freedom and democracy. There was no freedom or democracy in Europe. When we met Europe, feudalism existed and the reign of the kings and queens and nobility. It was during a time when kings would actually tell free men to shut up. Not the 21st century where free men tell kings to shut up, right? When we met Europe, this was the reality. This was the reality. When we met Europe, there was no such thing as ordinary Europeans owning your own homes, etc. This thing that we say, there's a saying in the United States that a man's home is his castle. No, the castle was the place where the nobility resided when we met Europe. The fact of the matter is, between the 4 short years of 1347 and 1351, half the people in Europe died of plague. And for the next 100 years or more, Europe still suffered the consequence of that and several other plagues. You cannot lose half your population in 4 years and have a viable economic life. It was a poor and impoverished Europe that rescued itself from poverty and disease by the invasion of the rest of the world. We are told that, and I was taught this when I went to school, that Europeans came to Africa and came to the Americas to export Christianity and civilization. They had an abundance of such in the United States. And this is why. But the reality is that Europe was impoverished and diseased. And if it had anything to export, it was poverty and disease. But Europe, with a vengeance, attacked the rest of the world. It attacked not only Africa, although we must talk about Africa because the conditions that we see confronting Africa today have their origin in history. It is not something that just materialized, as we are told, with corrupt leaders in Africa, etc. The corruption started a long time ago, and it was not in Africa. But we are talking about the wealth of an impoverished place, the development of an impoverished Europe, a place where up until the 17th century did not exist as a concept. We're talking about Europe as a concept, which achieved its identity as a concept through the process of slavery and colonialism. Prior to slavery and colonialism, Europeans identified themselves or defined themselves primarily in relationship to each other. It was only as a consequence of slavery, colonialism, the competing drive to capture human beings and the resources from around the world, that Europe increasingly began to define itself not primarily in relationship to each other, but primarily in relationship to the rest of us, Africans and the rest of us. It was a process which saw the entire ecosystem of the Atlantic, the ecological system of the Atlantic Ocean changed as a consequence of attack on Africa and African people being shipped across the Atlantic. Thousands and millions of whom would die in the process. Some thrown overboard, some refusing to go willingly and leaping overboard, some throwing their children overboard rather than see them go into slavery. Millions died. And the sharks, actually learned to follow those ships from Africa across the Atlantic. Schools of sharks would follow the ships that had Africans who we call slaves across the Atlantic Ocean. There is an umbilical cord connecting African people in the Americas and Africa, made of the skeletons crossing the Atlantic, a highway of bones of African people crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That is our connection. And that is something that I think is fundamentally important for us to understand when we look at where we are today, that it has its origin some time ago in the history of this relationship. And so we're talking about an aggression that against the China 1841-42, the so-called Opium War that turned China itself into a nation of drug addicts for the benefit of England, which was a participant in the development of the entire economy of Europe. We're talking about France, which in addition to what it was doing in Africa, held Vietnam as a colony, where for 100 years or more, most of the colonial resources coming from Vietnam to France was in the form of opium, drugs. There were at least 3,000 legal opium dens in France and in Vietnam under French colonialism. We're talking about Portugal, which by 1500 had brought out this is Portugal alone, which by 1500 had brought out some 700 tons of gold from Africa. These are resources that went to developing Europe, a Europe that was impoverished, a Europe that was diseased, and a Europe that was unfree when we first came into contact with it. Where does the wealth come from that we are now treated as beggars throughout the world? Despite the fact that today Africa is so wealthy in terms of natural resources, we are treated as beggars across the world. We are in Spain as illegals. We are in England and France as illegals. There's a saying among Africans. We say, we are here because you were there. And that is the reality that we have to deal with. And so I think it's necessary for us to talk about this, because both Africans and non-Africans live under some kind of illusion about this relationship, that somehow getting to America, getting to someplace in Europe is our salvation. When we are in Africa, that is how we feel. And then those Europeans and North Americans often feel also that somehow we are intruding on Europe and North America by being here, and somehow impacting upon the resources that ought naturally go to Europe and North America. But the truth of the matter is, when I walk down the streets in Amsterdam, and I see the incredible architecture and the obvious wealth, the magnificent social system that takes care of their elderly, gives them tremendous amounts of resources after they can no longer work. When I look at that, and I have to recognize the fact that Holland built itself of slavery, that the first Africans who came to North America came in slave ships from Holland, that Holland took so many resources from what we now refer to as South Africa. And the fact is that Holland is not alone in this relationship to Africa. And not only did these things happen, but on the backs of this, we saw of the slavery and colonialism, we see the emergence of the Industrial Revolution that changed all of Europe, where when we met Europeans, the vast majority of the Europeans lived as serfs, tied to the land in a feudal system, not like slaves, but the next closest things to slaves. They couldn't be sold as Africans were later sold, but if the land was sold, they went with the land, tied to the land in that fashion, without freedom. And now we have the emergence of all these resources coming from Africa and from the rest of the world that begins to transform European society. I'm told and was taught through my education, which was a colonial education in the United States, that European democracy and development occurred as a consequence of some really important ideas that Europeans had, Descartes, Rousseau, people like this, and they wrote incredibly significant things about democracy, and this is the thing that led to the bourgeois or democratic revolutions of Europe. But I really suspect that one of the things that had something to do with transformation in Europe was all of the resources that were now coming into Europe, and resources that actually challenged the nobility throughout Europe, challenged feudalism throughout Europe, so that you have these new entrepreneurs. Some of them were pirates. Some of them were adventurers who were able to get money from the queen to discover new worlds, so to speak. And you saw a new group developing. And they began over a period of time to bring so much wealth to Europe that they became wealthier even than the nobility. And a feudal system that placed restrictions, limitations on the development of a whole new social force, a whole new mode of production that overturned feudalism. This is the basis for the overturn of feudalism and the development of what we characterize as democracy and a whole new social system. It is wealth that came from Africa and from other places in the world. And this, of course, is responsible for the transformation of conditions in Africa and the rest of the world, and why we live today in a world where at least half the people on this planet live off less than $2 a day, $2 US a day. And if you keep up with the newspaper, you know that the US dollar continues to decline in value, so $2 US is not much. And where you look in Africa, you find that Africans live off $1 a day on average. Where in Europe, cows have an allocation of $2 a day. So that a cow in Europe has available to it more resources than an African in Africa. There's something wrong with that relationship, and it is a relationship that is reinforced and maintained at gunpoint. 1960s, all of us saw so much hope for our Africa. Sajifo, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, being such a shining example who fought for united Africa. People like Patrice Lumumba, great patriots who loved Africa and died for Africa. And there were others, countless numbers of others. We had so much hope for our Africa. And then, of course, what we saw was a terrible aggression against Africa. We are in this Congress now to talk about the relationships between North and South, but these are relationships which are imposed at gunpoint. Kwame Nkrumah was overthrown by the United States government. It created the coup. The United States government, France, and Belgium were actually engaged in a race to see who could kill Lumumba first. This is an objective reality. I mean, there's evidence of this today. I'm not telling anybody something that's a secret, right? Why? Because Nkrumah said that the wealth of Africa should belong to Africa and African people. And because Nkrumah understood that the colonial borders that had been created by imperialism locked us into poverty, and said that the only way Africa could survive and move into the future was through being united and liberated. And because Lumumba stood for the same thing, and people like Sobukwe in South Africa, and others. This is what we are contending with. It is no accident. Africa did not volunteer for this. It is the place on earth. Even the most rabid, reactionary, frothing at the mouth, right-wing forces throughout Europe and North America have to admit today that human life itself originated in Africa, which tells us that Africa is not hostile to life. It is the place on earth that is naturally the friendliest to life itself. Was nobody from Manchester in England or Paris in France that went to Africa and created life? Life emerged in Africa. Civilization emerged in Africa. Great civilizations. So why is Africa poor today? I contend that there's a relationship between the poverty of Africa and the wealth of Europe and North America. And this relationship is tied to slavery, to colonialism, and to instruments of coercion that have been created in the wake of slavery and colonialism to keep Africa trapped in the place where it is today. Because Africa is trapped into a parasitic relationship with Europe and North America. And all of us know, we're in a university here, and I'm sure they teach us what parasitism is all about. That a parasite must necessarily have a host to live on. You can't convince a parasite to leave a host. You can't pray a parasite off a host. Parasites must have a host in order to live, to exist. So it seems to me, the questions that we are confronted with is, what is responsibility of Africa first, and African people? What must we do to change the reality that through most of Africa, we see African women who will work all day just to get enough food for that day? We see African children who walk miles to get water because there is no clean water in most of Africa. We see people who are trapped in the most miserable kind of poverty in a place that has so much wealth, even as they are sitting in a place where they see their resources, their wealth leaving in lorries and trucks, going to Europe on a daily basis. We talk about immigrants. It is so difficult today for Africans to travel anywhere, to come to Spain, to come to the United States from Africa, to come to Europe and Africa. You can't come. You're some kind of illegal. What we must tell them is, when we come to here, we are chasing our own resources, which have been taken from Africa and transformed. You may have forgotten where they come from, but I remember. And those of us, all of us, have this responsibility. You don't have to be an African to hate this relationship. It is so easy for Europeans to sympathize with impoverished African people, send $1 to help a poor, starving African child. It is so easy. But what we have to challenge is the relationship. You know the British story of Robin Hood, who robs from the rich to give to the poor. That's not what we are about. We're not looking to rob from the rich to give to the poor. We must assume the responsibility to change the world of rich and poor, so that those where all these resources are coming from also have a right to live. So this is my contention. My contention is that the governments, whether in Africa, neo-colonial puppet governments, white power in blackface, most of them, or the governments in Europe and North America, certainly not North America, will not do anything to change this relationship. But people can change this relationship. But in many instances, you have to be willing to go against what your government and what the corporations in your government recognize as their interests. Because as you know, George W. Bush and the one who came before him and before him and before him saw as what was in their natural interest oil that is under the sands of people who live in Saudi Arabia and other places like that. Coltan that comes from Congo is seen as being their national interest. Right now, the United States is creating this thing called AFRICOM, the Africa Command, where we will create even more U.S. troops in Africa to control Africa. Right now, in the Gulf of Guinea, new, increasing U.S. military intervention. Of course, it has nothing to do with oil that they have found there, and the growing contest they have for oil with China that is also oil hungry, right? We are told that they're doing this for our own good. Like when they first came and got us, bring us to Christianity and civilization. We must say no. No to AFRICOM. No to this imperialist intervention. We must do this. The countries and the governments won't do this. And I want to finally say this. The primary project that I'm working on is called the African International, where we have as an objective of organizing African revolutionary organizations everywhere on earth where African people live. I speak passionately about Africa and as our Africa, not as some observer. We work in Southern Africa and South Africa right now. We work in Swaziland as well. We work in Kenya. We work in West Africa, in Sierra Leone, in Liberia, in Guinea-Conakry, under the worst kinds of circumstances under puppet governments that serve imperialism and not our own people. We work in Europe and particularly in England and throughout North America. And I'm sure that I have left something out, but our responsibility is to build the organization that Garvey and Nkrumah talked about. Africa will not be free. There is not going to be a free Ghana or a free Nigeria separate from the rest of Africa and African people. Africa must be free. Africa must be united in order to even have access to its own resources. We live in a world today where some Africans may even disagree with this. They say, oh, I'm a Nigerian, I'm Sudan, I'm et cetera, et cetera. And so I have no relationship to the rest of Africa. But even as we are having these silly arguments, there are Europeans from France, from North America, from Germany, from England, from Spain, from all these other places who are sucking the blood of Africa. And so they act like Pan-Africanists, even as we run away from recognizing that our Africa must be united and we have to fight for all of Africa. That is what we have to do in order to be free, and African people everywhere. So that's our primary project, is to unite, to build a revolutionary organization with the understanding that the freedom of Africa is going to have to be taken. It's not going to be given to us. And that we have to forge relationships with other freedom-loving people all over the world in this process. That's how I know who is my friend when I hear an argument between Hugo Chavez and the King of Spain. We say, viva Hugo Chavez, el presidente, el comandante. That's how we know where we stand, because we stand on the side of the future, and the future belongs to the oppressed peoples of the world. And we also say this thing finally. There's an issue that's assuming increasing significance in the world today. It is this question called reparations, to repair the damage. And we have been involved in this struggle for reparations for many years now. In fact, our party contributed to making the reparations issue a popular issue, taking it out of back rooms and closets. In fact, when we first started talking about reparations, we were considered a lunatic fringe who would talk about reparations. But increasingly all over the world, this discussion is happening. And right now, we are involved in a project to develop a world tribunal, an international tribunal on reparations for African people that will probably occur in what we call South Africa now. And we think South Africa is an ideal place to make this happen, because it is one of the places where there is so much illusion, where we are now told that there is a rainbow coalition, a rainbow nation, where all the people are happy after the release of Nelson Mandela and the ascension of the African National Congress to power. Of course, those are people who have not been there who say this. Those who have been there recognize that even today, in fact, when I was there in 2004 rather, I read a poll published by one of the South African newspapers that said in the 10 years at that time since the African National Congress had been to power, the African people had become 14% poorer, and the whites had become 19% richer. And in what they call South Africa today, you have an unemployment rate of more than 50%, 40% rather, and thousands of Africans who live in these shanty towns made of scraps, etc. And the people cannot see a future except for a handful of people who have been given tremendous resources in these economic scams that unites a sector of the African middle class with their imperialist overlords at the expense of the mass of African workers and poor people. And we think it's important to go to South Africa because there are still people in South Africa who are in prison, who participated in the liberation struggle, even under the ANC government, because they refused to participate in the so-called Truth and Reconciliation process, where both the South African regime and its people who worked for it to keep African people oppressed, and the people who fought against them are now to confess the crimes that they committed. So somehow, if you are a bank robber, you have to confess that you tried to rob a bank. And if you shot at the bank robber who was robbing the bank, you have to confess that you shot at the bank robber. So it equalizes both the actions of the oppressed and the oppressor. And so many people would not participate in this process. They are in prison in South Africa today. There are scores of them still locked up. And so we think it's going to be really important to be able to do this tribunal on reparations for African people, for Africans from around the world to come together, and among other things, to actually begin to quantify the amount of value that has been stolen from Africa and brought to Europe, because there are many Africans who live under the illusion that we are poor. But we who have been to Spain, who have been to the United States, who have been to Europe, we can say Africa is not poor. Look at what Africa has produced. All right? And so we want to come together and we can document, we can begin to quantify the amount of value that has been taken from Africa. We can begin to expose the audacity of a British government, of a US imperialism, and Europe altogether for claiming that Mugabe is the poster child for criminal behavior, because they began to take land from the squatters who stole the land in the first place. Where we can begin to talk about how Cecil Rhodes, who introduced the Maxim machine gun to what is now Zimbabwe, and on an afternoon would kill 5,000 Africans and then have champagne and tea afterwards, and how they brought mercenaries from England to whom they give thousands of acres of land for helping them to kill the Africans there to take the land. These are things that Africans need to understand, and everybody else around the world needs to understand as a part of our demand for reparations. So, our dear friends, I've spoken for a long time. And my comrade here has been extremely patient. And so have you been extremely patient in listening to me. But I would like to extend my profound appreciation to all of you for coming. And I do hope that we can talk about this question of Africa, the conditions of existence in Africa, right, in a more meaningful way. Because Africa does not need charity. Africa needs solidarity. Africa needs solidarity. So hopefully there's solidarity here. Africa, you know, we have so much work to do to liberate and unify our Africa and our people everywhere. I would like to leave you with a slogan that comes from the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania during its revolutionary heyday. It is Zulu. I don't speak any language. I don't even speak English well. And there's a story behind that too. When we have enough time, we'll talk about that. But in Zulu, it is call and response. I say, Izwe too. It means the land is ours. And you say, Africa. You've identified which land is ours. And I say, Africa. And if you are African, you say, Izwe too. And if you're not African, you say, Izwe nu, which means that the land is yours. If you want. I love that slogan. Can you work with me? Izwe too.
Africa.
Africa.
Izwe too.
Thank you so much. Uhuru.
Thank you very, very much, Mr. Yeshitela, for your energy, for your provocation, for your, as I told you, brilliant speech. Thank you very much. You have told a very important thing, that people can change the relationship effectively. This is our time for people. We start our debate. You can make your questions in English, in French, or in Spanish. It's the same thing because our translators can translate. But our translators need to solidarity as Africa, non-charity. Yes, for this reason, please, quiet. Thank you very much. Who is the first? Please. We have microphone? Sorry? Here? In this side? We don't have microphone? Okay.
Yo en primer lugar felicitarlos, yo estaba encantado de perfecto. Pero me ha faltado oír una cosa. Yo te da con las ganas de oír una cosa. Porque yo tengo una experiencia de 30 años en África. Y yo siempre, o sea, de fondo, yo cuando digo algo, algunas charlas y tal, o sea, comparto absolutamente.
¿Hay micrófono?
Pero, ¿qué opináis de los dirigentes africanos? ¿Qué opináis de los gobiernos africanos?
A ver si podemos acercar a alguien que acerque el micrófono allí, porque es que él no está oyendo, ¿sabes? Just a minute. Okay. Are you listening? Are you listening?
Yeah, but there's no.
Uhuru, comrades. So welcome back. And again, this is a presentation that Chairman Omali Yeshitela made in Huelva, Spain at the Congresso Internacional in 2007. And so we are going to stop that video there, but it is available to watch on the Burning Spear TV YouTube channel. And we will have follow-up presentations from that event shortly coming to the Burning Spear TV YouTube channel as well, and more videos as we continue to access them from the African People's Socialist Party's archives. So I just want to, first of all, just salute the profound presentation by Chairman Omali Yeshitela made at this event, and just say that when I first watched it, it reminded me of the presentation that he made in 2019 at the Oxford Union, and saying the same exact things, talking about these same exact conditions. And that this is, again, the consistency of the theory of African internationalism. And Comrade Mwezi in the chat says that Chairman Omali Yeshitela gave 600 years of history in under 60 minutes. So Uhuru, Comrade Mwezi, and again, just salute the profound leadership and presentation that we just saw from Chairman Omali Yeshitela. And we're going to have him on in just a matter of minutes to discuss this presentation. But first, I want to take a quick break to look at some announcements from our movement before proceeding with the rest of this study. So join the counteroffensive to stop the FBI attacks on the African People's Socialist Party and the African liberation struggle. Donate or volunteer to the Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa defense campaign today. For more information, go to handsoffuhuru.org to volunteer, donate, sign the petition, and sign the emergency response pledge. On May 27th marks African Liberation Day and the founding of the African People's Socialist Party, as well as the 3-year anniversary of the police murder of George Floyd. Join the International Day of Action, Saturday, May 27th, demanding freedom of speech is a human right, drop the charges against the Uhuru 3, repair the damage, reparations now, Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa. Be part of the worldwide movement denouncing the indictments of African People's Socialist Party Chairman Omali Yeshitela and Uhuru Solidarity Movement leaders Penny Hess and Jesse Neville, falsely charged as Russian agents. Take action with demonstrations, protests, teach-ins, tabling, banner drops. Let them know we will not be silenced. Go to handsoffuhuru.org/action to find actions near you or submit an action that you are organizing. One of those events taking place on the International Day of Action will be the African Liberation Day rally and conference, demanding Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa, drop the charges against the Uhuru 3 on May 26th and 27th in Folkville, the Gauteng West province in South Africa, or we call it occupied Azania. For event details for this and others, again, go to handsoffuhuru.org/action. And the Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa in London will also have an action on African Liberation Day. Protests outside the U.S. Embassy to demand drop the charges against the Uhuru 3 and the right to freedom of speech. It will be on Saturday, May 27th at 1 p.m. at the U.S. Embassy in London. Again, for event details, go to handsoffuhuru.org/action. And every Thursday at 8 p.m. Central Africa time, tune in live for the Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa, African Region broadcast that's hosted by Director Tafari, who is the Director of Organization for the Africa region, located in South Africa, and Comrade Morlai in Sierra Leone, West Africa. You can watch and follow this on Facebook at facebook.com/APSP Africa Region. Announcing the new book coming in June 2023 titled The Verdict is In, Reparations Now. This is the 40th anniversary edition of the report from the 1982 World Tribunal on Reparations to African People, including a foreword by Luwezi Kinshasa and additional testimonies and an epilogue by Chairman Omali Yeshitela. You can pre-order your copy now at theburningspear.store. Again, we are dropping this in June, so go ahead and get your pre-order. Right now, the chairman mentions this work, the 1982 World Tribunal for Reparations, in his speech in Huelva, Spain. So you want to have access to this book, to this history. Again, the verdict is in, reparations now. Make sure to like and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study, and support the Omali Taught Me show by donating now at paypal.me/Omali Taught Me. Uhuru Tours and Speakers Bureau is an institution of the African People's Socialist Party that coordinates events and tours for Chairman Omali Yeshitela and other party speakers and leaders. Book Chairman Omali and other Uhuru movement speakers for your campus or organization right now. And I would suggest going ahead and considering booking the chairman, especially when the book drops, for a book stop, book reading, and tour. So you can email us at info@uhurutours.com or call 727-914 3621. And for more events not mentioned here, go to theburningspear.com/events calendar to keep up with everything going on in the Uhuru movement and the African People's Socialist Party. So that will wrap up today's announcements. Thank you all for sticking with us as we now turn it over to the leader of the African nation and worldwide African revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela. Uhuru, Chairman.
Uhuru. Uhuru, Director Akili and Nai, I want to express appreciation for the introduction that you just did. And I want to salute all of you who have come on to this study on today. Again, a special shout out to our sisters and brothers and comrades on the continent of Africa itself. I do this because I know how difficult it is for you to be connected to the study. I know just because how Africa is being so bled of all kinds of resources, and I'm a resource that was stolen from Africa, as are the millions of African people who, against our will, have been dispersed around the world. I know that those resources have provided infrastructure and roads and electricity and clean water to the extent that exists in places like the United States and Europe and the other colonial powers. And I know it is precisely because those resources are here, including Black people ourselves, that they are not there serving Africa, and it makes it difficult for you to be able to participate in this discussion and this study, but also it also lays the basis for why it is that we have to make this struggle, we have to make this revolution, we have to overturn this relationship that we have with colonial white power. And that's something that I wanted to recognize, and also to brothers and sisters and comrades throughout the Caribbean, throughout the Americas, as it's now characterized since it was quote unquote discovered by Europe as a means through which Europe rescued itself from poverty, disease, and a lack of freedom. I know, again, there are infrastructure problems, difficulties. I know that Africans are living in Colombia and Bolivia and various other places, even there in Puerto Rico, without access to resources that ought to belong to us, and that our homelands are where we are living now are often treated as luxury places for European tourists, North Americans, even in the United States. Just recently back in St. Petersburg, Florida, where I had to go to be put in leg irons and handcuffed and taken and put in a cell because I've been doing the same things that I'm doing now. We see that these tremendous resources sucked from the African communities and given to colonizers who live and actually refer to St. Petersburg, Florida's paradise. That's because they have never been to the Casbah. They haven't seen how the colonized live. And even while in St. Petersburg, I was at a gym at the Y and got into a discussion with a North American woman and then another man, both of whom were from St. Louis and who didn't know each other until that point. And I didn't know them either. And they were wondering why I would come to St. Petersburg, Florida and leave, why I would leave St. Petersburg, Florida to go to St. Louis, which is so horrible, so terrible. And here they are in paradise. And that's what they're experiencing. And they don't understand that St. Louis is in St. Petersburg, Florida. It's every place that we live as colonized people. That's what we're talking about. So these are white people who don't even know what St. Louis is, who don't even know what St. Petersburg, Florida is, despite the fact that they're there. Like we live on the same planet, but all these resources come from one area of the planet going to this small sector of the population and create based on a social system of colonial poverty. So I recognize the difficulties that we have in communicating with each other, partially because, as I mentioned, the resources sucked from us. And welcome, all of you. And I also want to say that we have to recognize that, what is this, May 21st, 2 days following the anniversary of the birth of Malcolm X. 2 days following the anniversary of the birth of Ho Chi Minh. 2 days following the anniversary of the birth of Yuri Kochiyama. Of course, we know Malcolm X, and most of us, if we've lived long enough, studied anything about the recent history of the colonized people, know Ho Chi Minh, Uncle Ho, who led an extraordinary revolutionary movement against French colonialism and against all colonialism, and certainly had to fight against the U.S. as well, who actually made the statement that we believe in so dearly in our movement, that there's nothing more precious than freedom and independence. And that is the slogan that inspired the Vietnamese to go up against the most horrendous kinds of war machines that have ever been existed. And the Vietnamese who crushed the French colonialism in 1954, Dien Bien Phu. You heard Malcolm X speak about that if you've listened to Malcolm X's speeches, and then who ultimately crushed the United States power as well. And then Yuri Kochiyama, who was a Japanese woman who experienced concentration camps in the United States as the Japanese were thrown into concentration camps in this country when the United States entered the Second Imperialist World War, where, as you know, the United States dropped these horrific nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In fact, you just saw Joseph Biden in Hiroshima, where they are having this group of 7 meeting where they are talking about planning how the colonial powers will continue to starve the rest of the world and control the world's economy. Here's a place where they dropped atomic bombs on civilians. These are people who are civilians, and perhaps more than 200,000 people. Well, you had Nagasaki and you had Hiroshima. More than 200,000 people, mostly civilians, incinerated, evaporated by bombs dropped by the United States. So I just wanted to say that we recognize and respect. And Yuri, who was with Malcolm X when he was murdered, if you've ever seen the photos of Malcolm X, and there's this woman who has his head in her lap, that's Yuri Kochiyama. And she has been a supporter of the African liberation movement since I knew her. And she supported us, and she was with us in places like Oakland, California, and she was with us in Philadelphia and various other places. So we want to salute Yuri. We want to acknowledge this anniversary of the birth of Yuri Kochiyama, of Malcolm X, of Ho Chi Minh, and there were some other really significant forces. I think perhaps even Lorraine Hansberry, I'm not sure. Someone who was born on this day. Also, I think that part of what makes this presentation that we just viewed and listened to, depending on what kind of devices you are participating in this meeting, part of what makes it significant is the fact that you will see and hear that the presentation I made there, first of all, it was not unusual coming from me, coming from the African People's Socialist Party. Not unusual in the sense that I have participated in these kinds of conferences and others, going back for many, many years, winning support for the struggle of African people and embracing the struggles of other oppressed peoples around the world as a part of that process. I'm saying this in part because it belies this whole suggestion by the federal government of the United States, this institution of colonial state power that's designed to keep Black people and oppressed people around the world from being free, has claimed that somehow there was something peculiar about the fact that I went to an international meeting in Russia and condemn and that I have condemned U.S. war. As if that were unusual. Somebody made the comment that there was a similarity between the opening of my presentation in Huelva, Spain in 2007 and the one that I made in 2019 in Oxford, England, at the University of Oxford. And one of the things that made them similar is the fact that I opened up in both places with a condemnation of war, of colonial war that was being initiated by the United States government in Venezuela in Oxford, and in this instance in Huelva against the Iraqi and the Afghan people. So it gives lie to the whole notion that it would take some foreign power to have me and the party and the Uhuru movement come out in opposition to predatory colonial wars. We've always done that, and we will never not do that. As long as colonialism exists, we will oppose colonialism, and certainly we will oppose it as it relates to African people and other peoples as well. So I think it was important to talk about that. How we talk about is really interesting because there's a suggestion that some foreign power is responsible for what we say and what we do. And I was just struck by how in this presentation in particular, but it's not the only presentation I made where I talked about how the war that was made years ago against China in 1841 and 42, the so-called Opium War that turned China into a nation of junkies. And it's really interesting. I think it was 2022. I saw a transcript of a presentation that was made by the president of Russia, Putin, who talks about the Opium War. And somehow I'm supposed to be learning from them. I'm supposed to be getting leadership from them, but it looks like the other way around. The fact is that I've been talking about this for a long period of time because I've been describing an historical relationship. It didn't need any intervention from any foreign power in the world. The history is history. The thing is to unravel history, and the oppressed do not have a need to falsify history. Only the oppressor needs to falsify history because the oppressed can never be free as long as history is hidden. As long as it's falsified, we have to unravel the history and tell the truth because truth is objective. It is not something that somehow you just make it up and then it's real. So I think it's really important to say that this has been our stance all along. We didn't need any intervention. We didn't need any prompter. We don't read from teleprompters, etc. I wish we had one, but the fact is we don't do that. This is the history of the world, and we are part of that history, and we are determined to re-enter history in a way that we can take command of our own future by recapturing that history and the truth of that history. So I think that's important. And I think it's also important that if you look at this presentation, if you've seen other presentations I made over the years, you will see that for the longest period of time, you can go back at least to 1972 and see things that I've written that talk about colonialism. And even before then, we were doing because the whole colonial question was something that had many of us who were involved in the struggle for freedom, as it was characterized as one-time civil rights in this country, dealing and grappling with the colonial question and trying to take this whole question of civil rights and the relationship between class and race as it was once characterized. What is that? And we've been grappling with that and dealing with that for a long period of time. I'm saying this in part because there are some who make the assumption that the party is a wounded entity. And there's some forces that we see in the periphery of our movement, and some who watch this thing happen and assume that because of what the government attack on the party, that somehow they can join in some ways and replace the significance of the African People's Socialist Party. And then they begin to claim that these were their ideas in the first place. This becomes part of the war against us. But African internationalism is the philosophy that we have created, we have developed, we have done that. And not only have we done that, we have explored the whole question of colonialism. It was we who, you don't even hear discussion around the mode of production. You weren't even hearing any discussion about any mode of production. It's the party that reintroduced that. And then you hear that in this discussion that we just had from Huelva. We talk about the mode of production. We talk about all those things that constitute the mode of production. The war that was made on China. We talked about how all of these things and the thing that brought Europe into the world scene by colonialism, attacks on them. We said this is give birth to a whole new mode of production. This is where it comes from, and this is the thing that we have defined all along. We aren't the only ones who said colonial mode of production. We saw that in 1972 They were discussing that, and we saw this discussion happen, I think, perhaps in Lebanon and perhaps in India, some other places, because all the colonized people were grappling with this question because we knew the problem, the weakness that was coming from Marxists and those who had this Eurocentrist kind of worldview. We figured into this thing, we are the majority of the peoples on the world, and then definitely we've been left out and we've been defined only as auxiliary forces contributing to the development of Europe. We say that ain't right, right? And so we say that we shall not simply be objects of history, that we have our own history, we have our own brains, we have our own existence, we have our own future, we have our own aspirations, and we can define that for ourselves and strike out for us. That's what we did. That's how we even got involved in the discussion around the mode of production. I wasn't one day like a cultural revolutionary or cultural activist or something, and woke up and say mode of production. No. This is a struggle that we've been involved in for years and years and years. And this issue of the colonial mode of production is a consequence of development. And it's not just development of the brains, it's development involved in solving problems of the revolution, being engaged in the revolution, trying to change the world. And so, it's been said before, because there are a lot of people who have an explanation for the world. They can explain the world. Karl Marx talked about that philosophers have simply explained or interpret the world in different ways. But the point is what? To change the world. And so if your explanation is not involved in the process of change in the world, it's worthless. And if your explanation cannot change the world, it's simple air. That people are engaged in simple air, these kinds of discussions above the masses, above reality, etc. We're not interested in that. And don't be doing this messing with the revolution, because the war is being made against the revolutionaries, not somebody who went to a party and said they served cake and they served ice cream and it was on somebody's birthday. Let's call it a birthday party. No. It's not, it didn't happen like that. You understand? It didn't happen like that, right? So this is something that we just want to make clear. So this war has been made against those who are involved in explaining the world that we're involved in changing. And attack is being made against us, not because we're explaining the world, because the explanation, the work we do are involved in changing the world. That's why the FBI is against us. So join with us in fighting back against them and stop messing with us. Yeah. So I think that it's really important. We mentioned here in this discussion how this mode of production came into existence, and along with it, instruments of coercion. Did you hear we said that? Instruments of coercion came with it. And you know what coercion is, right? It's to force somebody to do something, right? It's to make them do something, right? It's the reason that you go pay your parking ticket, right? Even though you know that you weren't there as long as they said you were, right? Because they will send the police. They will do something bad to you, right? So instruments of coercion, they are police. This is called a state. And the state is, when you live under colonial domination, the state is not simply the state, it's a colonial state. And by which I mean is that since there has been in existence class society, their state has existed. And so you will find the state exists in the white world. If you go to Amsterdam, if you go to Holland, the state is there. The police will give you a parking ticket. It will do other kinds of things like that. They do that in Spain, where we were just where this presentation was made. They do that in what we call south of the Del Mar Divide here in St. Louis. The police will give you a ticket, but that's the state. But that same state, operating with sometimes the same laws, will park at a certain place on Hunt and Lucas. Is that what it's called? Lucas and Hunt? Here in St. Louis, and wait for you and make sure that when you get there, they're going to get you. They're going to get you all the time. So they say, but it's the same law for everybody. Yeah, the same law, but you got the state, which is a colonial state, and it acts a certain way toward those of us who are colonized. The same law that gives the police the ability to kill you and shoot you down, they just shoot us. right? It's the same law, the same state, etc. But colonialism is a colonial state. So it acts toward the colonizer different and specific way than it does toward those who are the colonizers. You with me on that? That's why you have colonizers who would say, well, you must have done something, because that don't happen in my neighborhood. You understand? Because Joe Friendly, Officer Friendly in my neighborhood, right, just helps to get cats out of trees, and little old white ladies cross the street, because if they don't help the little old white ladies cross the street, there's an African who's parked there who is going to jump out and snatch her purse, right? So this is the kind of stuff. And so NATO is one of those instruments of coercion. That's what we're looking at. NATO, that's what it was created for. The U.S. military created as there's no just war. The United States has ever involved itself in a just war in the history of the United States. And the founding of the United States was war made against the indigenous people to steal the land. And then other instruments of coercion were made to keep the land and to keep African people under oppression. They call them slave catchers, right? And things like that. Texas Rangers, which were civilians, white people, civilians, who went around to steal and keep the land from the indigenous and the Mexican people. That's what it was for. These are instruments of state power. These are instruments of coercion. So, and then the CIA and the FBI and Homeland Security and the NGA, and there's so many alphabets that I don't even know all of them, et cetera, that they are there for that purpose. And so you heard what I said here. We were talking about specifically what Africa and African people must do. We said all this stuff is happening to us. But this is what Africa and African people must do. We have to take control of our own history as a people. We didn't say some other country or force is supposed to come and rescue us. We do these things, and we develop relationships with other oppressed peoples and other people who are friendly to the ideas of freedom and liberation. We can establish relationships with them, but we don't work for nobody. We're tired of working for free. We're tired of working for anybody. We ain't been paid for the work we've done for the last 400 or 500 years. Why the hell would we try to get a job with somebody else like that? No. That's what we create independent economic institutions, not some relationship that's going to enslave us again. And we said that there. You can look at it. We say that we also mentioned that this is something that the people can change. We said we don't expect Europe, the powers, North America, the power, the governments to change, but the people can change it. That's why there's an African People Solidarity Committee. Also, that's why we organize among the people. That's why we create all these institutions among the people. That's why there's a Black Power blueprint to organize the people, to bring the people into the process of solving our own problems, recapturing our own history, recapturing our own power as a people, and redefining that power so that it serves us going forward, right? And then we say that the other people can join with. That's why there are comrades on this call right now, in this meeting. I see comrades whom I've known, from the Mexican National Liberation Movement, because the people will help to make this decision, and not just here, but everywhere around the world, the people can fight against and defeat colonialism, and that's the thing that has to be defeated. So we said that too. I'm just making that point because we identified what it's going to take for us to be free. And then I said my major project is doing what? Building the African Socialist International. That's the major project. That's the strategic drive that we are involved in. That's the thing that's taking us forward, building a capacity for self-liberation, not for some other force to liberate. But we say in the process of doing that, we will identify comrades and friends and people who love freedom, et cetera, that we will establish relationships with, didn't we? That's there. And so we will forge relationships with all freedom-loving people. And I think it's important to say that this was an important meeting. And they paid me to come there. And this was an NGO that was supported by the government of Spain. But it wasn't just supported by the government of Spain. There were forces who were there, who were formerly part of the United Nations, had posts in the United Nations. There were persons who were there who were with governments. I think the Ministry of Culture from Mali, perhaps it was Mali. If not Mali, perhaps it was where's the place where the horrible genocide was initiated, started, Rwanda, you know, I mean, and other places, they were there. This was an international conference where people wanted to talk about the relationship, what they call the North and the South, the oppressed and the oppressors, the rich part of the world, which was white, and the rest of us. And I went there, and if you noticed, perhaps you may have perceived this, that Congress did not expect my presentation. There were a lot of people there, and what I've gathered from that is that sometimes these international conferences happen, and sometimes they're done in a way that allow, you know, certain neo-colonial forces to come and they can eat well for a period of time, much better than people back home are eating, and they can hang out and, you know, do other kinds of things like that. Sometimes that's what you see. And sometimes, I think, generally speaking, you know, people will invite folk that they think will, you know, their narrative will be, their discussion will be constrained within the narrative that has already been in place, the colonial narrative. They did not expect my presentation. They did not expect some African was going to come there and be able to condemn this relationship that Europe has with us. They did not expect me to come and say, and Spain did this too, right? And all these other countries. But it was important to do that. It was important because our objective was not to please anybody, but to tell an objective truth. And then not just to tell the truth, but then to try to win who could be won. Did you hear me? I called on them. I said, you know, the people can make this change. I call on them not to feel pity for Africa, to feel outraged, to be in solidarity with Africa and the requirements for the liberation of African people and the colonized and oppressed peoples around the world. And this was a conference, and just like our relationship with the solidarity movement that we have created here, slogan for which is what? What is the slogan? Say it, somebody. Say it. Solidarity, not charity, right? And you heard, you know, how that statement was over and over again in that particular presentation. So I want to leave some time for us to have a discussion, Comrade Director Akile. I just wanted to and I think it's also important for this, to say this, that I talked about the conditions of African people globally. And I tried to make the point, and I made that our situation in various places around the world is simply an extension of the situation in Africa itself. That people try to make this difference, you know, like, you know, difference, you know, like you're so much better off, and then you know, you're not better off. All you got to do is come down to my neighborhood and say that we're just surrounded by people who are better off, you know. But the point is that we catch hell in the United States because Africans catch hell in Africa. Our condition in this country is an extension of the conditions of Africa. Our conditions in places like Colombia, extension of the conditions of African people in Africa. All these places that we've been forcibly dispersed to. It's no accident that every place you go around the world, you find Africans who are poor, Africans who are struggling just to try to survive, feed our children, have electricity, clean water, and the rest of that. That war started in Africa, and it's an extension of that war. And it's the resistance, is an extension of the resistance that started in Africa as well, because we never, ever accepted this. And being free has always been illegal since we met the colonizer, whether we were in Africa, whether we were in South America, whether we were in the Caribbean or here in St. Louis, United States. Being free has been illegal. And we've been fighting that process, that structure of illegality since we met the European colonizers. So I wanted to say that. And then what I want to do is call on you, dear sister, comrade, Director Akile, to go ahead and take control of the rest of this study. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Uhuru.
Uhuru.
Let's see. All right, Uhuru, Chairman. Well, I just really again want to just express my profound appreciation and just overall your leadership at that presentation, and it's a culmination of the leadership that you've provided for our struggle for the last 60 years of your life, and that what you've gone to say about how our explanation is not just something that is an explanation and just as it is, but it's a part of changing the world. And we know today that the world is changing and that it has been changed as a consequence of your intervention. And the fact that colonialism is something that's being discussed in these arenas that had never discussed it before, never entertained the question of colonialism and the question of reparations, far reaching. And, the other day saw that somebody was declaring, $14 trillion is owed to African people in reparations in this country. That is what you and the African People's Socialist Party have put forward and has given, people to permission to even address this question of reparations and to stand, for or against reparations. But the fact is, you forced it into the world arena, and that is just something that can never be undone. It can never go backwards. So just really want to salute your leadership and for at a time when that may have even been unpopular. I mean, this presentation was made in 2007. This was before we knew we were going to run for office in 2017 in St. Petersburg, Florida. And I mean, we often say that you have a way of predicting the future by way of a scientific investigation. So maybe you did see that coming in 2017. I don't know, but it's just really powerful to see how your work and the practical work that you've done and that this movement does has changed the world forevermore. And that's why you and this movement is under attack, but that's also why we're going to win. Because evidence and history suggests that it's on the side of the colonized, on the side of the people who want to fight for a better world, a different world. So just again, want to salute you. And there are comrades in here expressing similar sentiments. I want to just shout out Comrade Eugene Mason, who donated $20 to our channel as we were having this discussion. So Huru, thank you, Comrade Eugene, for your contribution. And we also had Comrade EL say, in response to the historic birthdays of Malcolm X, Ho Chi Minh, and Comrade Yuri, that Toussaint Louverture's birthday was May 20th, so just yesterday. So this is a really powerful weekend in history. So, so we're gonna take a brief moment for some questions, comments from our audience, and I want to acknowledge where people are watching from. We have Texas in the house, Lakeland, Florida, San Diego, California, Minneapolis, Minnesota, Chicago, Illinois, Battle Creek, Michigan, the United Kingdom, St. Louis, Missouri, Oakland, California, Fort Myers, Florida, Louisville, Kentucky, Grenada, West Indies, Collegeville, Pennsylvania, Marion County, Georgia, Portland, Oregon, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Fallbrook, California, Cleveland, Ohio, Montreal, Canada, New York City, New York checked in with us this morning. So Huru, comrades, thank you for tuning in everywhere it is that you're located. So Chairman, this first question came in from, looks like Comrade Paul. Let me just double check. This is from Comrade Paul, says, Chairman, was Cedric Robinson an adherent of the colonial mode of production? Did he make contributions to the colonial mode of production thought?
Thank you. I do think he made contributions. Cedric Robinson was a really important writer. He is someone who spoke to the issue of I think a sort of racial capitalism. He was one of those people who was struggling to give better definition to the rise of capitalism than what we had come, this Eurocentric view. that had marginalized African and other people in history. And so he was somebody who was grappling with these questions, as there were many people who were grappling with these issues. I think one of the things that distinguished the African People's Socialist Party, and even those who sat at our feet, who've now gone other directions, who claim to be originators of this. The thing that distinguished us, and I think that everybody would have to grapple with, is recognition of this thing that when Marx talked about the primitive accumulation of capital, it was a way that he was defining the rest of us out of history, except as auxiliaries for the development of Europe. The primitive, he had to answer the question: how did capitalism begin? Where was the capitalist production that created this capitalist system? Where did it come from? So he said that we had to presuppose that there was a primitive accumulation of capital that preceded the capitalist production, and then he defined this primitive accumulation that preceded it as turning Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins. He talked about what was happening in India. I don't know how many millions, maybe 50 million or more people in India died as part of this process. The people in what they now refer to as the Americas, all of this became a part of that, what he called primitive accumulation. In other words, it negated our existence except as factors contributing to the development of what came to be Europe. We're saying that was itself a mode of production. That was the thing that united the whole world into a single economy. There never was a world economy before that. And that was one of the things that we've been struggling with for years and years and years. And we've been saying it for years and years and years. And we've been saying how Marx was wrong. We said this, that Marx was wrong in terms of how he had been defining what we said over and over again, this vertical development of human society going from the lower to the higher, and that somehow we got from this primitive place where that was characterized as primitive communism. And the reason, of course, it was primitive is because white people hadn't achieved it yet. In the structure he had developed, this development would let Europe achieve communism after a certain level of so-called development based, that it was supposed to go through. So we've been challenging this all along. And Robertson has challenged some of these notions too. And there are others, brilliant people. And some of them are being helpful because some of them are academics. They study stuff. They actually, go and get some of the history and pull it together, and giving us things that we can work with to help to this development. And Cedric he's not the only one. There are others. There are people like Robert Allen who played a role in another way, in this discussion. So, but yes, I think Cedric Robinson was somebody who was a factor in the intellectual work that was being done to come to certain conclusions that we have come to up to now, and we are still developing, I should say. African internationalism is an ever-developing theory, and and I want to say that too, because it's the theory of African internationalism that took us to the place where we are in terms of this whole notion of the colonial mode of production. We didn't come to a colonial mode of production, and then it was based on a theory. That our practice based on a theory, our investigation based on a theory. This is the theory, and African internationalism is the theory that brought us to the whole recognition of the colonial mode of production. So I don't know if the others consider themselves African internationalists or not. They may have leapfrogged that part of the process, Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Well, okay. Yeah, this just reminds me of because I love this concept where you come into the middle of the movie and you try to explain to everybody else in the theater what's going on. Like you knew it. Like you didn't have to go through go through this whole process. And again, it's not just the the ideas. Like you said, if you just involved in a thought process, then that's all it is. But it's the literal practice, the on the ground experience, the training, and this connection or relationship to the masses of the people that inform, you know, everything that's even come to be African internationalism. So our next, oh, sorry, Chairman.
Mayor, yeah, I just wanted to say this contributed to developing that thought because, you know, there's a theory, you know, of gravity that people are not familiar with. And I'm not going to get into the fact that for thousands of years in Mali and other places like that, we had discovered how, you know, the universe, you know, was the whole stellar system worked. But one thing that was understood because of the theory of gravity, because of this understanding of gravity, it could be, you could see, they could determine of where a planet was sometimes, or that a planet existed even if they couldn't see it, because they understood gravity. And why could they determine it? They could determine it because they saw other planets that would fluctuate, would move in a certain way that presupposed there was another force that was affecting it. It was a gravitational force. So something was out there. There was a planet out there that made that planet act in a certain way. So the question of theory is so important. We're African internationalists. We come to the conclusion on the mode of production because we could see the planet moving. You understand? We could see other planets moving. We knew something was out there. You understood? And that's what took us to the whole issue of the colonial mode of production, because we had been tracking this and watching this over periods of time. And we saw things happen this way, that way. There must be something else out there, and we tracked it down. That's what took us to this place. I just think it's really important. I don't know if I obscured the point I was trying to make or not, but anyway, I made it much more confusing than it needs to be. But go ahead, Comrade Director.
Uhuru, Chairman, no confusion here. I just really want to unite with that. And we're going to move to the next question. I could say more, but want to make sure we address people who are listing their questions right now. So this question, and also I can read this comment from Comrade Matsamela, who is the president of the International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement, says, Uhuru Chairman, I like Cedric Robinson, met him and learned from his students. The difference with us is that African internationalism arose as an attempt to not only explain the world, but change it. However, I know for a fact that Cedric would agree with us because the purpose of his book was that Africans created our own dialectical and historical materialist tradition of our own. Many people, including those who call themselves Black Marxists, either do not get this or opportunistically neglect this. So that's his comment. And then the question that he raises is, Uhuru Chairman, would you agree that that it is another problem with the idea of racism as the system we face as African people in the US, even when people call it structural or systemic racism, it creates some sort of differentiation between the oppression Africans face in the US versus Africans elsewhere?
It creates a differentiation between the oppression and exploitation African experience in the United States and elsewhere, but also that Africans and other peoples experience. Africans do not exist in isolation from the world. We are part of the world. That's how we could tell that there was another planet out there, because we are part of a world. And I think that's really important. Those people who claim to be Black this and Africans that, et cetera, but somehow try to situate the conditions and struggles of Africa in isolation from the rest of the world and make a horrible mistake. That's what historical materialism helps us to understand, Comrade Matsamela. So yeah, you're right that it does try to differentiate this whole racial thing between Africans and other peoples, other Africans, but other peoples as well. One, two, the other thing that it does is it reduces our struggle to one against ideas, as opposed to changing the actual real world. That the ideas that we experience are born from material reality, from things that exist in the world, and not the other way around. And so I've seen things, and I'm sure you have, because you're much more involved in cultural stuff, investigation than I am. But some people have said that certain kind of music in the 60s were responsible for making this revolution in the 60s. And I'm saying it's the revolution that was responsible for the cultural expressions. And that's why, you could have Aretha Franklin, who was hitting it, and talking about freedom and et cetera, on one time. And then after the revolution, she's who's zooming who. You understand? Which is a big difference from what it was when the revolution was hot, and the garbage that we've heard subsequent to that, to the defeat of the Black Revolution, when there was no revolutionary movement that ideas were obviously tethered to, so Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, and Uhuru, thank you, Comrade President Matsabella, for your question. Chairman, that I think about like the African Revolution of IET, how the slogan was "Coupe tête, voulez kai." It wasn't in structural racism or anything like that. It was the colonial question. And that you've pointed out the same is true for Vietnam, that the Vietnamese were not going to the French and the U.S. imperialists, saying that we have to end racism. It was a struggle against colonialism, freedom and self-determination. So, Uhuru.
Just developing that idea. We've said there's somebody in the room too, come at Akile, that we're gonna have to hear. But it's like there have always been like two tendencies, two trends in the struggle of our people, not just here, but globally. And one trend has been to really kind of surrender to the reality that we live in, and then say, let's find ways to improve the plantation, the slave plantation, So let's find a way to prove we can live better than this. We can get these many days off. Maybe we can get some time off. Boss can give us some time off, and maybe on Thursdays he won't beat us so badly, or maybe they'll extend these other kinds of rights on the plantation. Same thing was true with colonialism. I think early in his life, I read that Patrice Lumumba had the idea that every African in Congo should just make friends with a Congolese, with a Belgian, and that was going to contribute to our freedom. So you find a way. You've had this tendency, this trend to try to improve life on the plantation. Then you had Nat Turner, who was saying strike at night and spare no one. You understand? And ending the relationship with the plantation. And then you had revolutionary movements who said that we're not trying to make an improvement on colonialism. We have to destroy colonialism if we are ever going to be free. And so that's the kind of thing that you're looking at. You look at people who engage in this struggle about structural racism and all this other kind of stuff. How do we live better under colonialism? And I'm saying that colonialism got to go. We have to get rid of colonialism, take colonialism out of our lives. We have to take command of our own existence as a people. Dignity requires that, if nothing else. Uhuru, yeah. And I am going to turn it over to this brother in here. You mentioned the idea about people having discovered reparations, and it's almost comical, except it's not. In St. Petersburg, Florida, where you are now located, the mayor there, whose father played a big role in taking that plot of land from us that in the so-called gas plant. I forgot how many businesses were destroyed, how many Black families were moved out of there as a consequence of the city taking control of that land, has now becomes an adherent of reparations. In opposition to the position that we were taking, that land should come back to the Black community with interest in terms of the stuff that needs to be developed on that. In St. Louis, the mayor has become an adherent of reparations. And the most progressive, what is she? Congresswoman has become an adherent of reparations. That's who we were speaking of when you talk about the $14 trillion that's owed us. But none of them has said a thing about the war that's being made on the black movement that's getting reparations, that made reparations a household word, that they cooperate, all of them cooperate with the state to put us in prison for making reparations what it is, right? And that's the truth that we have to coexist with, but that's their truth. Our objective continues to be, no matter what they do, what they say, we have to continue to organize, bring people into this process and make them redundant, make these sellouts, make these opportunists redundant, make the people the driving force, that reparations will be real because we make it real, because we won the people to it. At the moment we win the people to reparations, they become unnecessary, they become redundant, and we are winning thousands of people to reparations every day. That's who paid for these basketball courts that we create. That's who's paying for Black Power Blueprint in many ways that we are doing. Reparations is happening, and it's happening without the people who you just mentioned, without the stuff that they're talking about. We are doing it, and we will make reparations real.
Uhuru, Chairman, right on. And we are winding down in time, so we're going to take this question that's in the room in St. Louis. Uhuru, comrade.
Whose house? Uhuru house.
But I just really want to appreciate the presentation, this study. I really unite with Director Kile's contributions and interventions and everything. A lot of things that she noticed I would had on my notebook. But I wanted to just really appreciate you, Chairman, for how you go into these situations and into these international arenas and speak as the leader of the African nation. And you speak to us as the African, nation. And just one thing that I just really stuck out to me. You said, to them, it is the responsibility of Africans, ourselves, to get the European domination, to end colonialism. And I think that's profound in the fact that, you coming in as an African, like this is us, this is our responsibility. And like you said, the solidarity, everything that you're saying about the solidarity, not charity and things like that. I think that was, right on point. And that really, spoke to me. And I just think, you kept doing that, just talking about the, we, meaning the African, we must assume the responsibility to change the relationship between the rich and the poor. I mean, you talking, just speaking as us, as the objects of history now, not just the
subjects.
I always mixed it up as the subjects of history, not just the objects. So I appreciate that.
Uhuru, thank you, comrade. Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman. Were you going to respond?
No, I thought it was, I really appreciated Comrade Timber's intervention. There was a time where he did a lot of traveling with me, and he's been in some of these situations that he's referencing in international arenas. Yeah.
Uhuru, well, Uhuru to Comrade Timba, and to all of you, want to thank you all for tuning in. We are getting to the near now end of the show, but before we do, Chairman, want to just ask if you have any closing remarks for us.
Well, I think that the thing I would say is that one of the things that's really troubling for the existing colonial powers, led, of course, on a very shaky foundation by the United States, is that the world is something that they no longer have absolute control over. And that's internally. They have white people climbing the walls of the Capitol and defecating on the desk of big-time politicians and chasing the vice president down the hall, talking about killing him. They have stuff they cannot control that's happening throughout this country, with a sector of the white population rejecting most of what is the narrative that has propelled this country for the last 75 years politically. And there's economic crisis that abounds. You have the international community where people around the world are rejecting the dollar, the hegemony of the dollar, and rejecting the U.S. Political hegemony. It's a fundamental crisis that they're confronted with. And they see us as a part of this crisis. They see us as factors in this crisis. And to the extent that the oppressed, the success of the oppressed in winning our freedom contributes to the crisis, they are correct. Our objective has to be free. And our people have to be free. And this country and this system has always denied the right of the group to be free. They've permitted individuals to be free. They've allowed for individual Black people to be successful, but the group, they deny success for the group. And what we have been told as the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement is that you cannot work for the success of the group. If you are going to be successful, it's going to be as an individual. You can be the African People's Socialist Party, call yourself what you want to call yourself. We'll even allow you to have certain economic institutions and things like that if it's not being done for the group, if it doesn't contribute to the emancipation of the group. And what we've said is that our fealty, our loyalty is to the group. It's to Africans, to African people, the African working class, and to the oppressed and colonized workers of the world. That's who we fight for. That's who we will continue to fight for. And we'll do that despite the fact that the oppressors find that objectionable. There's no other way that we can do and exist as people with dignity, as a party with dignity and with any kind of integrity. So I just wanted to say that, and to say that we shall continue to be relentless. We shall continue to vanguard up Uhuru.
Uhuru, Chairman, well, thank you so much for those closing remarks. And throughout this whole discussion, and I saw this comment section in there with this presentation, we are our own liberators, and that has been the position since the very beginning. And just want to really, really thank you again, express my unity and just appreciation for your profound leadership. And to all those who were tuning in with us today, I want to remind comrades that next week is the International Day of Action and African Liberation Day, which celebrates the founding of the African People's Socialist Party. That's going to be May 27th. Connect to an International Day of Action near you, or build your own. And you can learn how and learn all that information at handsoffuhuru.org/action. Again, that's handsoffuhuru.org/action. Get connected, build your events to raise up the demand to drop the charges against the Uhuru 3, Hands Off Uhuru, Hands Off Africa, reparations now. And make sure to follow the chairman on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and subscribe to the Burning Spear TV on YouTube to catch every episode of the Omali Taught Me Sunday Study. Uhuru.
Uhuru.